if I over prepare, strangely, that frees me to not do what I've prepared. And it's the same in stand-up comedy. The more I know the skeleton of what I usually talk about, that frees me to go into the audience, improvise, because if it doesn't work or it's not interesting, I can go back to what I know is exactly in the shape of what's to come next. And it's the same with interviewing. So I love having something really ready, but then not using it at all. That, to me, is a great conversation. Every time you do stand-up comedy, it is a test. So I've been doing stand-up comedy for 28 years, and I don't do it full time now. I just do it about one weekend a month, just to keep my wheels oiled and just to keep testing myself. But every time you do stand-up comedy, Andrea, it's a test because the metrics, the measurement for speaking is completely different when it comes to comedy. So whether you're doing a presentation, speaking at a business conference, performing Shakespeare, you'll probably get a little round of applause at the end, and you're measured with that. With comedy, there's only one measurement, and that is laughter. So if you don't get laughter, then you failed. So it's always a test. So I just there's a brilliant comedy club in Newcastle near where I live, and I host a show there about every month, Friday and Saturday. They have a different lineup, and I compare it and run the night and host the night. And then sometimes I go back and headline, and that's a real test. I have to do about 30 minutes of comedy, and it's always, to me, a test, always hard. But I'm happy to report this time I passed, but you're only as funny as your next gig in comedy.
So you made them laugh, yeah?
Lots, yes.
But
It was
it
good.
is
I
true.
enjoyed it.
I love stand-up comedy, and I think about what you also do, what we do in our company in terms of public speaking. The stand-up comedians are perhaps the best speakers because, first of all, they are naked, like they don't hide behind lecterns, they don't hide behind PowerPoint. They are there, they tell a story, they need to make a connection with the audience, with the added difficulty, as you said, of you have to make them laugh in a business presentation. I mean, you can, if you make people laugh in a business presentation, and of course if it's connected to your content, that's great, but you don't have to. But if you're a stand-up comedian, you have to. Now, today I wanted to have a chat with you, Alfie, because one of the things you do is you hold lots of interviews. You are a host, and we're going to talk about how to do that well, how to do that effectively, how to hold an effective interview. Let's start with your preparation. I'm curious, Alfie, when you need to interview someone, well, take me through how you prepare yourself, not for situation like this now. And by the way, I feel a bit of pressure today because I'm interviewing someone who knows how. I'm not a professional interviewer. I'm the host of the Ideas on Stage podcast. I love it. It's just something I'm passionate about, and I love chatting to people on this show. But I'm not a professional host, so there's pressure for me today. But take me through your preparation. How do you prepare for situations when you need to interview someone?
Well, just my background in short, just so people know where I'm coming from with regard to interviewing. I worked on the BBC for many years, nearly 15 years, where I interviewed politicians, pop stars, business people, Olympians, Oscar winners, prime ministers. And I still don't feel professional in some ways. So I was always learning. And also, Andrea, I do think you are professional. You're extremely professional in the way you do it. I've been on Zoom with you before, and you were just great. You're a great listener, and we'll come to that as being, I think, the most important skill of all. But I did used to over-prepare, if I could. I certainly still over-prepare for any live event where I'm on a big stage and I'm interviewing people. I'll be interviewing people in a couple of weeks. I've got a meeting about that tomorrow, a big entrepreneur conference that I do every year, and I love it. And some of my favorite interviews have been at that spring conference. And I want to keep that gig because I love it so much. But the way to keep that gig is to keep preparing and almost no more than the subject is expecting you to know. But there's a real fine line between trying to over impress the audience and over impress the guest. I think the audience and I think the speaker should, because you've over prepared, they should pick that up rather than be told by you that you would not believe how much work I've done today. I don't think that's your job. I think I like to try to work out in my preparation. I try to think of questions they wouldn't always get. There might be some that they're always expecting, but what can I ask that no one else has asked? How can I bring something up in a certain way that will surprise them? How can I do something interesting, unexpected, make this fresh, make this really different for them and you and for the audience? So I'll give you an example. There's a man who's been in the news, Peter Mandelson, who the Prime Minister Keir Starmer could resign because of Peter Mandelson in the next few weeks. Peter Mandelson was a very, very skillful politician, and he was very, very difficult, notoriously difficult to interview because he's so slippery and skillful. And the reason he might be bringing down the Prime Minister is he went and became the ambassador in America with Donald Trump, and he was in the White House, and then he was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and everything, all the House of Cards collapsed. So when I was interviewing Peter Mandelson, he had a book that was being released. He'd written his memoirs. And I watched him being interviewed by other people on his trail to sell the book. And what he did in all of the interviews was berated or tripped up anyone who hadn't read the book. And he would test them. So the first thing I did was read the book. I thought, you've got to read it. It was a big book and I read it. But I also knew he was so strong on politics. And he was being interviewed by these really punchy, hard-nosed British journalists, and none of them laid a glove on him. So I thought, I'm not going to beat him in that area. So I thought, what can I do? That's interesting. Now, this was a guy who seemed to be, he was always called the Prince of Darkness, and he had this sort of image of being quite a dark character. So I looked at the book and I got post-it notes and I put it in the book every time Mandelson cried or was against type, against what we expected. I think his dog died at one point. And it was just stuff like that. So I thought, just ask him about these times in his life. Nobody else asks him about these times. So I went down that route. I didn't make it sound like I'm just going to ask you about times you've cried, but I tried to skillfully navigate through those areas. And certainly on audio or podcasts or radio, the loudest sound is silence. And I got silence from Peter Mandelson. And that was a result. That was a result. That was enough for my management to say, wow, you did something other interviewers haven't done. And I think if you can achieve something a little bit original, something that's a little bit different, something that's a little bit unexpected, it's worth aiming for. Now, I did it recently and failed. So I tried, as a friend of mine, I was interviewing a friend of mine for a business dinner, and he's got quite an interesting background, but he never talks about it. So I thought I'll try and prize this out of him because I think there's some gold there, and I really think I can work something out of that. And I tried everything to get to that. And every time I tried, the shutters came up and he didn't want to delve into that. He just didn't think that was important. And that was a disappointment for me. No one in the room was disappointed. No one in the room knew what I wanted to happen with that interview. But I think every time you go to bat as an interviewer, there is gold dust out there, but you don't always get to the gold. It just, every single podcast interview you do, every single radio interview or journalist interview will not give you that magic moment. But I think if you aim for it, you've A, got a chance of success, and B, you'll probably leave a pretty good interview trying to achieve that. So going back to your question, my preparation usually involves trying to think of something that no one else has thought of, taking an angle that is a bit new, is a bit fresh. And here's a little trick. I've used this every now and again, especially if I'm interviewing a panel of people. I will look at their LinkedIn feed, if they're on LinkedIn or Instagram, and I look at the last big post that they did. And they never expect that. And usually people start at the beginning. So how did you get into business? Tell us about how you came across a hurdle. If you start something fresh and now, it really wakes them up into, wow, I'm present. This guy's on it now. This guy wants to talk about me now. So if I've got a panel, and it usually scares them a little bit because they're not expecting it. If you've got a panel, you say, I've looked at all of your recent LinkedIn posts, and they start going, what did I post? Which one? And so I'm just going to go along. And nearly always, it's something they're really passionate about. It's something they're really interested in now, something they want to talk about or sell now. So you'll instantly have, this guy wants to talk about me, not churning out the old stuff from the past. So I often do that, or try and find something fresh, or use Google and look at them under the news category and see when they were last in a local news story, maybe national, maybe international news story. And sometimes journalistic outlets create a story for clickbait, and you will have something of them that is in the news that they may not even be aware of. And you could say, I noticed that the Belfast Telegraph said that you're going to be giving a talk. And they go, really? I didn't know I was in that. And you're showing them that you've done due diligence and you've done preparation.
The trick about the LinkedIn post, I started doing that since I met you, Alfie, because we had previous conversations and I've learned this from you. That's why, for example, I asked you at the beginning about the stand-up comedy thing, because it was one of your last posts on LinkedIn, and I've been doing this with other guests as well. So thank you for that tip. And also, Alfie, I've got lots of follow-up questions already based on everything you said. Let's see, we could start, for example, you mentioned the word over-prepare. Do you think that you can over-prepare, but in a negative way? And what I mean is that, yes, you are very prepared, but in a way that doesn't allow you to make the conversation feel 100% natural.
Yes, I think if you over-prepare, I think where you make the mistake in over-preparing is you over-prepare in a way that you want to go through all of these bits. For me, if I over-prepare, strangely, that frees me to not do what I've prepared. And it's the same in stand-up comedy. The more I know the skeleton of what I usually talk about, that frees me to go into the audience, improvise, because if it doesn't work or it's not interesting, I can go back to what I know is exactly in the shape of what's to come next. And it's the same with interviewing. So I love having something really ready, but then not using it at all. That, to me, is a great conversation. The worst kind of preparation, I think, where you've over-prepared everything and you want it to go like this, I think is almost going to hold you back, because it can prevent you from listening, because you're so intent on going, I must ask A, B, C, D. If you're really intent on going to D, you might not be listening to a piece of gold that could be the bit of magic, that could be the moment that really sets fire to the interview. And I sometimes love, if a conversation, I did this at an awards dinner, people were being given, it was a theatre, and people who'd been connected to the theatre were being awarded honorary certificates. And I had a chat with them, and I had all my questions ready for a guy I knew well, and I'd researched it and everything. And he said something, and it just went like that. It went in a crazy direction, and I ripped my questions up. And everyone cheered and laughed, and he laughed. And there was a sense that, well, like, obviously he's got some other questions, he's going to pull them out, and I didn't need anything. And honestly, Andrea, the amount of times I prepared in detail, but never had to look at that piece of paper. That to me is the beauty of over preparation. Over preparation, over delivery, where it doesn't work, is where you're so committed to what you want to happen. I think you can lose that conversation, and that there should be a conversational flow to any kind of interview like
That's
this
that's
one.
that's what that that's what I meant. Yeah, exactly. Which is connected to listening, because it is true, and also sometimes I find myself making that mistake that you want, of course, you want to listen 100% actively, you want to be present, but sometimes I find myself thinking about what I'm planning to ask next. And I know I shouldn't be doing that. I know that I should just be 100% present and listen, because as you said, sometimes if you don't, you may miss that golden nugget.
Yeah.
And tell me more about the because you said at the very beginning, listening is perhaps, or maybe without even perhaps, the most important skill we need to have as hosts, as interviewers. Tell me about
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. I again, personally, I have a rule for me. And when I have a good guest, it is never to put me in the story. And I picked this up from years ago from, I trained to be a priest. I don't know if you know this. Many years ago, spent 15 years in a religious order, and I was a
I think I
brother.
missed this. I think I missed this. I
Okay.
didn't know that.
Okay. So as a young boy, I wanted to be a Catholic priest, and my family weren't religious or anything, but eventually I went off. I trained to be a priest, and then became a monk in a religious order. And that's all I did till I was 29.
Wow.
But one of the skills we did was we learned to counsel, and it was a great course. And I remember the priest who trained me said, never put yourself in the story. And by that, he said, even small examples, like if they say something, you should never say, I know exactly what you mean. I know what you mean, because you don't. Only there, even a comment like that can put you in this. I know what you mean. I've been through what you've been through. It's almost, I think it's acceptable to say that is very interesting or that is fascinating. But when you start to put yourself in the story, I think it takes the spotlight away from the guest. So another example from recently, I interviewed a guy called Jamie Lang, who he's recently been on television a lot. He's invented this candy kittens, I think it's called, and he's on Radio 1. He's been on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Made in Chelsea. He's become an established kind of celebrity. We did a Zoom meeting beforehand. We went through what I would ask him, and he said, ask me anything you want. There's nothing out of bounds. You ask me anything. So I had all of these areas to go down, but I again prepared all of these things, knew all of the details, and he wanted to turn the spotlight back on me because he was enjoying the conversation, and he said to the audience, "How good is this guy?" Now I was quite well known with this audience, so they all sort of cheered, and he commented on the suit I was wearing. Now, when I give a talk, I tell a story about the suit. And the audience, there was a chunk of the audience who knew the story about the suit.
Is it the
And
brown
he
one?
said, yes, the tan suit. So I'll tell you the story later. But anyway, he says to me, He said, "That is a great suit." And the audience rippled with, "Oh," as if to say, "Go on, Alfie, tell the story about the suit." And he picked this up. He went, "What is it?" I went, "It's not my show. This is yours." And I deflected it very quickly, very, very smoothly, and got the spotlight back on him because he was the guest. That's my rule. I do that for me because and it's interesting. I had another friend who's a public speaker, very gregarious guy, and he'd never seen me interview like this before. And I was interviewing Alex back to back with the guy who founded Lad Bible, which is huge, and he sold it for millions and millions. And Alex Partridge, founder of Lad Bible, now nearly only talks about neurodiversity, ADHD. Back to back, two speakers in front of a business audience nearly only wanted to really talk about ADHD and anxiety. Now, I know the audience need to know other stuff. It's a business crowd. However, when I realized the audience couldn't get enough of this, you could hear a pin drop. I was thinking they're enjoying this. They want this. I thought it might be too much back to back, but they loved it. Now, in my research for Alex Partridge, I'd watched lots of his interviews on YouTube. And while I was watching it, I was practically diagnosing myself, saying, I'm clearly what he's on about here. I'm neurodiverse. I've got all these things going on. Everything he's describing to me. It was my absolute rule to myself to not say that in the interview because it wasn't about me. I didn't want counseling. It's not my job. My job was for him to share his story with the audience and get the best out of him to do that. And so, going back to the question, the more I prepare, the more free I am to listen deeply. Both of those, I had lots of unasked questions that I'd planned to ask about their business journey, and that I thought that's what the audience might want to hear, but the audience really wanted to hear about anxiety, neurodiversity, and the reaction, not from me, but from them, they were so good at speaking, was we love those two guys. And there was an Olympian on after them who's brilliant, but didn't come anywhere near the value because I actually didn't interview the guy who's on after, and they tended to go through his career and what did this mean and then what did he do, and it would be something you would find on YouTube. But they were a new interview and they did really well. But I think following people who'd opened their hearts and let it out was just something else. I'll give you another example where I do think there are two things I tell people who want to host and want to interview. If you open yourself up to hear a conversation in great detail, magic can happen that you haven't expected and that you haven't planned for. I'll give you an example of that. Another thing, you can still engineer something you want to happen, like I got with Peter Mandelson. I engineered emotion, but the spotlight wasn't on me, it was still on him. So I interviewed the guy who invented Hotel Chocolat. His father invented Mr. Whippy ice cream. It's quite a good story. But I hadn't eaten chocolate in 10 years. So I decided, I thought, I've heard lots of people interview this guy. He loves his chocolate, but wouldn't I have a moment of theatre if I told him I hadn't eaten chocolate in 10 years? And we did it. And he looked disappointed when I told him that, but then I knew I could bring him round and get him extra happy by saying, but I'm prepared to break my duck if you teach me how to eat it properly. Well, he turned into a different animal. He got everyone joining in, and I had a magic moment. So I'd engineered that, but he was still the star. He was still leading the way, but I was very happy with that because it went just as I wanted it. The other time that I often cite is one of my favourite interviews was with a man called Sir John Timpson, who's a big English businessman, and he founded the key cutting shops. You find them in supermarkets. They've usually got a kiosk in the supermarket where they'll cut your keys or change your watch battery or fix your shoes. Timpson's big brand. And he was an inspirational figure. And I was absolutely blown over by how brilliant he was. But I'd already discovered this in the research. When he
Timson is the Alfie. Timson is the company that's very good in terms of company culture with how they treat their employees. Is that
yeah. He employs an awful lot of criminals, ex-criminals, and because when he started that, the Sun newspaper did a big splash and it said "Cons cut keys." And the truth of the matter is, he looks after his people so well that less than 4% of those ex-criminals reoffend, which is incredible. And everyone who works for him gets a day off for their birthday. Everyone who works for him gets use of a holiday chalet if they've been there for more than 5 years. Everyone is looked after. And I always need a Timpsons every now and again. And whenever I go in, I love telling the people who work there, I've met your boss. And you know what they always say? Isn't he great? How rare is that? And he's got this upside down pyramid of management leadership where he says, I only have 2 rules. And he said, sometimes I'll go in and they'll all stand to attention. I'll say, no, I'm here for you to tell me what I need to do for you. I'm working for you. This is an upside down structure. So he's only got 2 rules. Look good and don't put your hand in the till. Don't steal anything. Everything else is your decision. You're the boss. You do the payment structure. You do what goes where. It's your kiosk. And it's fantastic. And he showed this got an amazing reaction. He showed this huge chart when he interviews people. You know, Mr. Men for children, Mr. Men and Little Miss figures, they're little characters. And it's like Mr. Happy and Mr. Smiley or Mr. Greedy or Little Miss Sunshine. And all you have, if you're interviewing someone, you appoint entirely on character, not on qualifications. So you have a map of all these Little Miss Mood Hoover, Little Mr. Joyful, and you have a conversation and you ring whichever ones you like and you see what you've got most of, and that's how you get the job. Well, everyone got the phones out and everyone's taking photographs of this because they can't. What a system, unbelievable. And I was so lost in the conversation and swept away by the way he looks after his people. I asked a question I hadn't prepared and I didn't know the answer to, but I was so engrossed, listening so deeply. I said, what do you do for HR? And he said, well, we don't need that. And the whole room gasped. And that was my moment. That was unexpected to me because I didn't know that was the answer. I didn't know that was the case. Having said that, if I did know that, I would have had to, I suppose, hold him to account and say, you do need HR. But you managed a way of not using it because there were HR people I spoke to afterwards and they went, that's a little bit worrying. But still, it was a moment people talked about. And those are the moments I talk about when you chase a moment. Either you engineer one, like I did with Peter Mandelson or Angus Thirlwall from Hotel Chocolat, or you listen deeply for one.
Before we continue with this episode, I just want to share a few resources that I think will be super useful for you. The first one is check out either my book, Confident Presenter, or my colleague Phil Wakenall's book, Business Presentation Revolution, or both. These are books for business owners and leaders who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. To make the most of the books, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. And then also, at the moment, I'm running a series of free presentation skills web classes, and I'd love to see you there. The links are in the show notes. Now, let's go back to the episode. Going back to the example you gave earlier about the neurodiversity, ADHD topic that was being shared in that particular event, and you noticed that even if you had a different plan, you noticed that the audience was enjoying it, and so you just you went with it. Now, if instead you had noticed the opposite reaction from the audience, as a host, knowing that you had a different plan and knowing that your research suggested that the audience needed something else, but still the guest, the speaker, wanted to go down a particular path, what would you have done as a host?
Well, that's interesting because the client who booked me to do that interview did not want me to ask lots of questions about ADHD. And I knew the client wanted me to ask questions about scaling, about business, about the tricky part of having a business, and how do you get to these figures, and these were your figures last year. And I knew that was my instruction from the person who was paying me the money. And yet I could feel something magic was happening here. So I just had to show bravery, and no questions were asked. The person who booked me was thrilled. But I think they'll always be thrilled if the audience are thrilled. You are always having to navigate what's right for the show, what's right for the audience, and what's right for the person who runs the event or the producer. So you are sometimes trying to please too many people, and you'll never please them all. But I think I've been doing it for quite a while now, where I hope I've got an instinct for what is right. And I've got an instinct for where, well, that's too long, that's too short, that needs to be addressed more. And again, a lot of it comes back to preparation. I do think over preparation sets you free and gives you the freedom to relax into the conversation, because you know you can go back and serve the other portions. But sometimes you don't know till after the event as to how it's truly gone. And I didn't finish telling you, but that pal of mine who watched it, he got up and said something, and they had a hug. He hugged Alex Partridge because it all got very moving. It became almost like some kind of evangelistic moment. But my pal said to me afterwards, he said, I have to say, I don't know how you did what you did without putting yourself into it, because I would have put myself into that. No question. And he doesn't think that would be wrong for him to do that. I think I do, but he would have got a good interview, but people would have been talking about him just as much as the guest. I try and learn from every kind of interviewer, every kind of talk show host. There's something that they do that you can learn from, either good or bad. And think, well, they interject too much, they talk too much, they don't listen enough. They listen, then they wait, they encourage silences, they'll leave it a little bit awkward.
Anyone in particular who you look up to at the moment, who
Yes.
still...
Yeah, I love the American talk show hosts. Now I know they're not hosting a business conference, and they're not well, Conan O'Brien does an amazing podcast, but I think Stephen Colbert he's about to end his role because they're getting rid of the show, but fantastic on CBS. I think he's just a master at making it fun, but listening. Also, he is from an American school of improvisation, where if you improvise in that style, you always take what is given to you. So by that, I mean, no matter what you've got planned, no matter what you want to do or say, if the guest says something one way, you must bounce off that. You always take what they give. British comedy improvisation is very different and relies on you improvising, but you're always trying to get your own joke in. And I'm not a fan of that style. I much prefer the Conan O'Brien, in particular, Stephen Colbert, and I love David Letterman was my all-time comedy interviewer,
Great,
because
great, David.
he never did things in a conventional way. He never, all of the brilliant bits of David Letterman on the internet are unexpected, are crazy, unplanned, a strange part of his brain asking a question that Jay Leno and all of the others would never have asked.
On that point, conventional, unconventional, I remember, Alfie, when you hosted when you delivered a session at our academy for our students, one of the, and you mentioned this already here, you said, in your preparation, I always try to think about unusual questions that guest has never been asked before. And you gave, I still remember the example. You said, okay, you could ask a question like, if money was no object, what would you buy? Or if money was no object, what would you not buy? And the
Yeah.
second question
That
is much more interesting.
Yeah, yeah. That's well remembered, by the way. That's someone who really listened. And I use that as an example for people who want to get into radio because to me, the most boring thing to listen to on radio interviews are lists. So when people ask a question, you hear this. If you go traveling up and down the country in the UK and you flick round the local radio stations, you will hear lazy interviewers, and I make no apology for this, saying, what are you having for your tea? Let us know what you're having for your tea tonight. John's sent us a message. John's having potato chips and meat. Jane is having jam sandwiches. Michael is having fish and chips. It's just a list. There's nothing there's no story there. That's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to move in any direction other than that. Just a flat line. And I just think if you spend 10 more minutes thinking of a more interesting question, you will come up with a more interesting piece of audio, an interesting piece of. Now, Stephen Colbert's worth looking at. He does something called the Colbert Questionnaire. Now, he does ask very mundane questions, but he asks it in such a way as if it's the deepest, most culturally enlivening set of questions anyone has ever been asked. And
For example,
he plays it. For example, what is your favorite sandwich? But he doesn't say it like I just said it. He asks it like he's asked it as if it's never been asked to anyone before. Now, the guests try and outdo each other. So I'll give you an example. Jeff Daniels, because of the way the question was asked, Jeff Daniels, the actor, he gets this special type of bread and he puts peanut butter, a centimetre of peanut butter on the bread. Then he gets a special kind of potato chips, crumples them up, then a special kind of barbecue sauce on top. And me and the kids have talked about this. We're going to try this sandwich. He sold the hell out of the sandwich because he didn't just say a jam sandwich, the end. He talked about it like it was the Gettysburg Address. It was something intense and something fascinating and something, but it's just a sandwich. But he made it interesting. And I remember lots of times hearing on radio, what would you do if there's always a story about someone winning the lottery? And they always ask the question the next day. You listen around the dial, you'll always hear some lazy radio DJs saying, what would you do if you won the lottery today? What would be the first thing you would buy? And I always used to try and ask a question every day of my listeners for 15 years on the radio, and I would always try and turn it on its head and think everyone else in the country will be asking this. What can I ask that isn't that? So if you put a tiny bit more thought into the same kinds of questions, you transform the interview. You will transform the experience for you and for the listener and for the guest.
this is another thing I've learned from you. So if I became maybe a slightly better interviewer over the last few months, it's thanks to you and the tips I've
No,
learned
not at all.
from you. Yeah,
You put the work in yourself. You put the work in yourself.
thank you. And thinking about questions, out of curiosity, Alfie, do you have a question in particular that you often ask, or maybe it could be a format for a question that you often use that always gives you a great response from the guest?
I think certainly in business, entrepreneurial audiences, I think to me, it is about what is of most use to the audience who are there. So, for instance, I was at a castle this morning, at Lumley Castle, where I interview a different guest every few months, and the audience is always SMEs. small, medium-sized enterprises. So whoever the guest is, we have a meeting beforehand or a Zoom, and I always ask them if they can translate what they do or how they did it to that audience. That's what always works. And that, I would say, is the same for every kind of audience, whether it's a comedy audience, whether it's a small business audience, whether it's an audience of people in finance. If it's a certain size of entrepreneur who's scaling, I think if you can, the best question is the one that serves the audience, I think. So the best example of this I interviewed at that castle recently was a guy called David Bruce. Now, David was part of the London Olympic bid. So he was part of that team. The London Olympics were very successful, and the opening ceremony was done by Danny Boyle, and it was quite unique. It was fantastic. So David was part of that. Then David went to America and was involved in MLS. He brought Lionel Messi, the Barcelona player, to play in America. That was David's
I know
work.
Lionel Messi. Yeah.
There you go. So David got Lionel Messi to play in America. That was part of David's job was to convince him to come. Now, David's from Sunderland, which is my sort of football club that I quite like a lot. David said the only job that would bring him back to England was to work for his home club, Sunderland. David came back to Sunderland, and Sunderland, I don't know how much you know about soccer, but Sunderland
I do.
against against the odds last season, they won 2 matches in the last 2-3 minutes of the game, and David Bruce spearheaded this campaign called Till the End. We must fight till the end. That was he masterminded this. It's all over the city. You see it painted on walls, in murals. It's all over the internet. And that was David's thing. So David has an incredible track record. London Olympics, what a save. Lionel Messi. And I said to him, he said, how do you want me to do this? I said, well, your stuff is so big and it's so grand. It's almost beyond what they can comprehend. But if there was any way you could translate what you do for them, I said, that would be amazing. He did it like I've never seen before. It was perfect. Everyone was buzzing, and everyone left that castle telling me how good he was, best guest we've ever had. And what he did was he served the audience. And he honestly, everything from, he changed the Sunderland badge design, and which was a bit of a move because you're meddling with history and heritage, but he made it, he kept something of history in it, but he also wanted to make it relevant to new fans and young fans, and he won both old and new fans. So I asked him, how would that translate to this kind of audience? And he just gave, on a plate answers. Now, you might not have Sunderland Football Club, but you will have a garage. You will have this. And he mentioned what businesses were in the room. And this is what you could do. That's the same, but just using different tools. He did the same with how do you persuade someone to join your team, Lionel Messi. And he used his tips, tools, and tactics from his own skill set, but made it relevant to the audience. And that is quite a skill. And if you can get your guests to do that, it's magic. You really, really do get the best out of the guest and the best for the audience.
That's the number one principle in communication. Sharing something, sharing a message, an idea that's relevant to the audience. Yes, and it applies in public speaking. It applies when you are being interviewed, when you are interviewing someone, finding a way to bring that out from a guest. And let's go back to Timson, because earlier you mentioned that said, we don't need HR. And you said in hindsight, maybe I should have said, no, you do need HR. You made me, it's just an example, but you made me think about something. In that situation, it's not that you were disagreeing with the guest, but in general, you are holding an interview, and let's say that you disagree with that person, especially if they are talking about something that you have expertise on. So, for example, Alfie, if I'm a public speaking coach, so if I interview someone and that person says something about public speaking or in that space, and it's not science in the end, I can disagree with that statement. In a situation like this, do you recommend challenging the guest on that particular thing, or is it better to just let it go?
I think in some ways, my experience at the BBC, they almost insert a chip into the back of your brain, so you always seem to want to provide some kind of balance. So I'm quite good at knowing where the line is, but also I was used to holding people to account and, if someone has said something controversial, pressing them back or maybe challenging them to an alternative view. And I do think it's good if you can push people a little bit and just cause a little bit of, because if you just, you know, blow smoke up their backside, really nobody wants to watch just that. So I sometimes do challenge people and sometimes do push them if I think it's required and if I think it's worth exploring something. I will.
What's an effective way to do that without sounding arrogant or pushy?
Yeah. Well, I again watch people like. Do you remember David Frost? David Frost was, one of the great interviews. Frost Nixon. His style was never confrontational. His style was always very gentle, and his style was always incredibly curious. So sometimes you can disguise holding to account or pushing back or challenging with deep curiosity. Andrew Marr does that very well. Kirsty Young used to do it really well on Desert Island Discs. I'll give you another example because everyone remembers him as a very hard, pushy BBC interviewer and they called him a Rottweiler. Do you remember Jeremy Paxman? Well,
No.
Jeremy Paxman was one of the senior political interviewers on the BBC, and he would frighten the life out of really serious journalists, prime ministers. He would always have them on the edge of the seats. But his most memorable interview is when a politician refused to answer whether he overruled someone with regard to a prison policy. It's a famous interview. It's on YouTube, and just look up Jeremy Paxman famous interview. You'll find it. And it's his best interview, and he doesn't shout, he doesn't scare, he doesn't get angry. He's just very controlled. And he just says, "Did you threaten to overrule him?" And the politician gives an answer that isn't the answer. And he starts to smell blood. So he just repeats the same question. I think 13 times. He goes, "But did you threaten to overrule him?" And the guy's getting deeper and deeper, and he's going, "But did you threaten to overrule him?" And you don't get tired of him asking the same question because he won't. And it's brilliant. But my point is, you don't have to shout and you don't have to scream. I think you get many more results by being deeply curious and by being inquisitive and just being deeper with your questions and deeper with your curiosity rather than, "I need an answer now." We were sometimes encouraged to be a bit like that, but my style was not that style. My style was occasionally, I remember one interview I did at the BBC where, again, it came from deep listening, but I did lose my temper a little bit, and it was with, the education body Ofsted, who go
Yeah, of
around
course, yeah.
schools and they tell you whether your school should be marked rubbish or closed or done very well. And I was interviewing someone high up in Ofsted, and they were in the studio, and they were being quite cocky and smug, and I was picking this up and not enjoying it so much. And out of nowhere, I said, "Who inspects you?" There's that silence. They didn't say anything for long enough to mean to know
No
that there
one.
was a follow-up question. And another great sight, if you're in a radio studio, my producer's head came up through the glass and starts looking over his computer console at me as if to say, what's going to happen next? And the guy started fumbling and go, well, of course, we have to answer to. I went, yeah, but who? Is there an equivalent to Ofsted? And it was clearly a no, but he wouldn't say no. So I then knew I could go further, and I can remember I was angry now, and I'm saying, you go around schools like the Spanish Inquisition, outstanding rubbish. No one does that to you on the same. And it got to the point where the interview finished and they offered to come back on to answer the question properly because the guy had not obviously given the right answer. They came back on. So that was a result. But again, I thought I was at liberty to take them on because they were putting themselves in a very particular position and were a bit smug with it as well.
You also need to understand the moment.
Yes.
And before we close, a couple of other things. Another curiosity: do you watch your own recordings?
Essential. Yeah. As uncomfortable as it is, this is I would say the only thing that will truly make you improve. You can watch David Letterman, you can try different tricks, but unless you've watched yourself try to implement some of this, none of it works. So I was on radio, for nearly 15 years, and I remember I had a co-host when I started on the radio, and she was a brilliant journalist, Charlie Charlton. And we used to go every Wednesday to do what's called a snoop, which is a commercial radio term, and it just means listen back, basically. And we would go back and we would listen to just not all of the whole show. We would just listen to 5 minutes, which is still quite a long time in radio terms. And we would listen to 5 minutes of us against 5 minutes of either one of our heroes or one of our rivals. And we would mark ourselves and then we would mark them on particular criteria. So our boss, this is radio, so you'd have different criteria for a podcast or for doing it on a stage. But we would say, okay, how many times have you mentioned your name? Have you mentioned the station name? Have you mentioned the weather? Have you mentioned the time? Have you made people laugh? Have you said something of interest? If there's a truck driver driving through our area and they were listening to that, have they got all of those things in 5 minutes? And we would mark those things. And if we were doing an interview and the interview was too long, you know, we mark ourselves down. And then we listen to 5 minutes of someone else and we pick them from the same time, 8:15, the same day. So if I was flicking through the dial, did I get a better 5 minutes with that person or with us? And whether it was a rival with us. Now, it's so uncomfortable doing that because you just start squirming and you can hear when you've gone on too long in an interview. You can hear where you've been sloppy or you haven't been paid enough attention in an interview or you haven't given the station name check. So we were quite ruthless with ourselves and we never ever came out of that thinking we were brilliant. We always came out of that thinking, right, let's get the sandpaper out. Let's sand it all down. Let's not do that again. Let's not do that again. Let's make it smooth. Let's make this product constantly slightly better than the last time we did it. We did that. We never missed. Other people hated that so much because people don't like listening to themselves or judging themselves or looking for faults in themselves. People usually don't like doing that. So consequently, they didn't improve. But I would say Charlie Charlton and myself, we went on to be Station of the Year and we won awards and we had the most listened to BBC local breakfast show outside of London. That wasn't us. That was the system. That was the Snoop. And I
Yeah.
guarantee anyone, if you've got a podcast, if you've got any kind of interviewing you do as a panelist, or if you do stand up, if you video yourself and really forensically look at yourself and you can do it with someone else. It's good if you can do it with someone else. But our boss rarely had to say anything. He just let us hear it back. And he would just say, it was almost like the Socratic method where you know the answers deep inside yourself. You will tell yourself if you're honest enough. And you'll go, yeah, that we've let that go. That was too baggy. That was too speedy. That wasn't thought through. And I just think you cannot improve unless you really look back and try and get the chisel out and just keep sculpting, make your offer better and better and better. And it did. I mean, it got to the stage towards the end that boss said, I'm finding it very hard to find faults here. You've really got rid of a lot, but there's always room. There's always room. And when you stop doing it very quickly, habits creep in and laziness creeps in, and you think you're not needed to improve anymore, and it can slip very quickly.
It gives you awareness. Without knowing what's
Yes.
going on, it's very hard to improve. Like, for
Yeah.
example, because I also watch all of my recordings, especially
Brilliant.
on the podcast. And one thing I've noticed recently, Alfie, is that when I think about what to say, I tend to look. For those who are just listening, you can't see
Yeah.
me now, but I look in the upper right corner of my room, and I think that as you think through things, if you do it from time to time, it's okay. But if you do it all the time, it can be a bit of a problem. And I've noticed watching my own recordings that I need to be careful because I tend to do it a little bit too much. So that's just an example.
Good spot. Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. Do you clearly enjoy this, Andrea? You're very comfortable doing this. I mean, what are your processes? What are your aims
I
with interviewing?
I agree with you 100% with when you talked about over preparing in a positive way. For me, that is the solution to pretty much any challenge you may face in this particular context, but also from a public speaking perspective, same thing, which doesn't mean, you said it also earlier, you can't always control the outcome. We can only control the controllables.
Yes.
And the one thing that we can control always is our preparation, and that makes a difference. Now, Alfie, talking about mistakes that people make when interviewing people, and please don't be kind, don't be nice to me. What mistakes have I made today in this conversation with you?
I think you've been brilliant. Absolutely enjoyed it. I think you have challenged me a couple of times, but I think you could be a little firmer with a challenge and a little more provocative, not for the sake of it, just develop it into your curiosity. And I'll give you an example. When I do a panels I think are a challenge to make interesting. And it's usually because most business panels, most conferences, when they have a panel, all agree. And that is dull as dishwater. So it becomes, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? We all think the same. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And I have trouble sometimes trying to mix that up and trying to I don't want people shouting or arguing, but I want a conversation. I want a little bit of difference and a little bit of polarity. It's interesting. Two conferences, big conferences that I've done for years, have both said we're not going to have any more panels. The audience feedback is we don't get much out of a panel. So I do think one way to get something out of a panel is to put people on, have a mini debate or have something more at stake. So with that in mind, I wonder whether you could just inject a little bit more bravery or a little bit, tease me a bit more, just
Yep.
you could inject, you did at times say, I think this or I do that. I think you're free to say, I'm not sure if I agree with that because I think this. It just gives it a little bit more of a frisson of danger. How we would chat, that's how we'd chat in a pub. Or we would get a little bit more animated or a little bit more, drama. All drama needs conflict. Drama doesn't work without conflict. It's conflict and resolution. And I think interviews are the same. A little bit of conflict, a little bit of tension. So even if it was when I said to the guy, I've never eaten chocolate before. He went like that. His whole body dropped. I went, but, and then we turned it into a dramatic moment. And
Yeah.
I suppose
No,
the
Alfie,
one
I
yeah,
totally
yeah,
understand, and thank you for your piece of advice. And it's also true that even beyond the debate and the drama, it is true that, for example, when I listen to other people's podcasts and shows, I love it when it's really conversational, where it's not okay, question, answer, another
yes,
question, answer. When it's like a conversation in a pub. That those are the
yeah.
shows I enjoy the most, and I know that, for example, in this particular show, I need to improve to create that kind of dynamic. So thank you for the
Well,
reminder.
it has been a great conversation, by the way. I would happily chat to you in a pub, and I can't believe how long we've been chatting, and that's always the sign of a good conversation where you think, I just feel like we've been going for 10 minutes. It's been great.
Alfie, for those who want to connect with you, say hi, learn more about your work, where should they go?
Join me on LinkedIn. It's all there. I love LinkedIn. LinkedIn is my I've got a website. I'm on Instagram. I'm on all kinds of different channels, but LinkedIn is the main one. I post on LinkedIn several times a week.
Okay, perfect. We are going to include your LinkedIn profile, your
Brilliant.
link in the show notes. Let's close with this, Alfie. If I gave you complete control over this
Mm.
interview, what question, if you think about the topic, of course, of today's conversation, what question would you have asked yourself that I haven't asked instead?
Great question. I would have included that question, but you've included it. I suppose if I was going to be harsh, why did you not go further in radio, maybe into television and progress that way? Because that's the way, I suppose, at one stage my career was heading in that direction. So that might be what I could
So
have asked.
that might be the question. And what's the answer to that question?
The answer is I loved radio. I had no desire to do any more television. I'd done bits of television and it's a very slow process. But I think I started to enjoy business conferences, live conferences, big audiences more, I suppose is the answer. And think the confines as well of being in the BBC restricts you from saying certain things. As good as it is and as brilliant as it is, you are almost free to use your own voice when you leave.
Understood. Makes sense. Alfie, thank you so much. It's been great chatting with you and great to see you again after your great session at our academy. Let's keep in touch. All the very best.
You're a great man. We'll share a stage one day, Andrea. Let's make it happen.